This is Daniel Sledge on July 30th, 2025 at around 11:20 a.m. in Washington, D.C., conducting an interview for the Global Oral History of PEPFAR project. To begin, could you start off by introducing yourself? Tell us who you are.
Tim Rieser. I have worked in the Senate this is my 40th year. Most of that time, about 37 years, was as a foreign policy aide to Senator Patrick Leahy, and as what we call Democratic clerk for the Appropriations Subcommittee that funds our international assistance programs around the world. Now I work as a, quote, senior advisor to Senator Peter Welch, who took over Senator Leahy's seat when Senator Leahy retired.
Fantastic. So could you go back a little bit, tell us about your background, your family, where were you born, where did you grow up, how did you become interested in these topics?
I'll make this short because I don't think it's terribly relevant, but I grew up in Vermont, therefore ended up working for Vermont senators. I was a public defender in Vermont for several years. I didn't want to do that forever. I volunteered for Senator Leahy back in 1984, 85. I ended up working in his office initially as just a typical young staff person answering mail and that kind of thing. I was always interested in foreign policy, and I eventually, and I can't really remember how this happened, but that became more and more my role, and when he became the chairman of the subcommittee on the Department of State and Foreign Operations, which funds all our international programs back in 1989, I moved over to the Appropriations Committee. I became an Appropriations Committee staff person, and I did that job first as kind of the number two person, then as the kind of staff director for that subcommittee for the next 33 years or so. I did spend a year, or no, half a year in Sudan in between being a public defender and working for Senator Leahy. There was a big famine in Ethiopia, and I worked as, again, a volunteer over there with the UN High Commissioner for Refugees and the International Rescue Committee.
Interesting. Could you tell me a little bit more about your time, what you remember of your time in Sudan, and maybe did you have sort of a sense of what the role of America in global public health should be during that period?
Well, about 1 million Ethiopians, very hungry people, starving some, had flooded into Sudan, eastern Sudan, from Tigray and other provinces. A couple of things I learned. One, having a law degree was useless. If I had known how to repair diesel water pumps, that would have been useful. But I found ways to make myself useful one way or the other around certainly the poorest people I had ever been around in my life. People were dying in these refugee camps just from hunger. I think I came away with basically two impressions. One was that the international relief operation was fraught with problems. It was not nearly as efficient as it could be. There were a lot of egos. There was competition among the different implementers, from the UN to the NGOs who were working. But overall, on the other hand, on the positive side, they saved, hundreds of thousands of people. And it was pretty remarkable what they were able to put together in a short time in very desolate parts of eastern Sudan on the Ethiopian border. The US role was really more just financial. We contributed the bulk of the budget for the UN High Commissioner for Refugees and also for the relief operation implemented by other humanitarian organizations. So, it showed that overall, and I've learned this since, that this was actually one of our biggest strengths in our international assistance programs, was responding to humanitarian crises. Again, a lot of problems. You know, rarely does anything go exactly as one would want, but had a huge impact. And eventually, you know, it started raining again in Ethiopia, the famine subsided, and people went home.
Fascinating. So you're in Sudan, you come back, you begin working for Senator Leahy. Could you tell us a little bit about him as a politician, as a public servant? Who is Senator Leahy?
His background was actually as a state's attorney in Vermont. So he was a prosecutor in Burlington and Chittenden County, and you know, didn't really have any international experience to speak of during those early years. He was elected to the Senate at the age of 34. He wasn't initially a member of the Appropriations Committee. He was on the Armed Services Committee during the latter years of the Vietnam War. In fact, he was a deciding vote to cut off U.S. funding for the war. He eventually was appointed to the Appropriations Committee, and for the next 40 plus years rose in seniority to the point of ultimately becoming the chairman of the Appropriations Committee. So he was a senator for 48 years, and from the 1980s, mid-80s, when he became a member of the Appropriations Committee, and it might have been earlier than that, but certainly since he became chairman of this subcommittee that I mentioned, the State Foreign Operations Subcommittee, he became very involved in international affairs, and you know, his interests were principally on how to put the best face of America forward, and that meant through the ways in which we engage with other countries, other governments, and particularly he became very interested in global health, in international environmental issues, in human rights, in ways to support freedom of expression and democracy around the world, and so, you know, from someone who began as a small town prosecutor, he became, you know, a pretty vocal and visible you know, I don't know how you would describe it, but activist in terms of how to use our role in the Senate, and particularly on the Appropriations Committee, since that committee funds the government, to implement, to influence policy and programs around the world, you know, for the betterment of people who are particularly like those that I saw in Africa and many other places.
So you come back from Africa, start working in Congress. Obviously there's a crisis in Africa, but there's a crisis already emerging in the United States in terms of HIV, AIDS. What was the thinking in Congress and with people that you interacted in Congress about HIV, AIDS during the early period, so the 1980s?
Yeah, I mean, in that period, it was barely an issue, and there was a lot of discrimination. It was in our country, it was quite localized, principally among the gay community, and it was not an issue, therefore, that most members of Congress wanted to take on. Certainly the Reagan administration didn't. And so we lost a decade, really, as a result of discrimination and just apathy. Even though it was happening in many countries, you know, the fact that in our own country it was still quite isolated meant that it hadn't really attracted the attention or motivated members of Congress to address it in the way that it should have been in those early years. So we lost about a decade, I would say, as a result of inaction. Now, in terms of our response to the emerging global pandemic, again, it was very slow early on. And I remember myself, because by then I was working for that subcommittee, and another staff person in the House whose name was Mike, and I can't remember what his last name was, but he and I somehow got together to try to work on this. And I remember that the first funding that we were able to get included in the budget, the international assistance budget, Senator Leahy and whoever his counterpart was at that time in the House, was $50 million. And, at the time that seemed like real money. But compared to, where we've come to, where we're now spending, $6-8 billion on, or at least up till this administration, to deal with HIV/AIDS, as well as, other major infectious diseases. It shows you how, it really started with just a small amount that, I think, like so many things here, it takes, time to incrementally build up to a point where you're finally actually dealing with the problem as it needs to be.
Thinking about, again...
Mike Williams.
Mike Williams? Okay.
That was his name.
Fantastic. So thinking about this era, you probably uniquely had on-the-ground experiences on the continent. Did you have a sense of how members of Congress, other people working in the ecosphere that you were in, did you have a sense of their knowledge of what was going on the continent?
In those early years, there was undoubtedly some, but it just wasn't a priority. There were, as there often are, a lot of things going on. And, as I said, it wasn't yet a significant issue in our own country, and therefore, to some extent, even less in other parts of the world. And, I think a lot of people just didn't understand what was happening, or, weren't either in a position or inclined to do anything about it. That said, I think there were undoubtedly some of us, certainly Senator Leahy wasn't the only one by any means, who was aware of what was emerging in not just Africa, but other parts of the world, and the need to address it. But, like so many things, the Congress is a very reactive institution, and it's not one that gets from 0 to 60 quickly. It takes time, and often a lot more time than it should. And in this case, certainly to address a problem which then exploded.
Yeah. Do you have any recollections of the passage of the Ryan White Act?
I do, but that was a domestic piece of legislation, and I didn't work on domestic issues. I was only working on international foreign policy, and the budget for international programs. So yes, I remember it. I remember what happened to him, but I wasn't involved in that. Certainly Senator Leahy's office was.
Yes.
But other staff who were handling domestic health issues would have been the ones to deal with it.
Understood. So thinking about foreign policy during, going back, again, 80s, 90s, you're not very involved in domestic policy. Do you have any interactions with HHS, Dr. Fauci, people like that?
Not at that time. Not at that time. Again, there's another subcommittee that handles the budget for
Right.
Health and Human Services, and each subcommittee is relatively autonomous.
Yeah. So moving kind of into the later 1990s, thinking about the Clinton administration, obviously there's a big change in how people are talking about AIDS from Reagan to Bush to Clinton. How did you observe those changes, and did they have any implications for you in making policy?
Well, we certainly were looking for ways to increase the contributions that we were making for international AIDS programs implemented by USAID, by others, whatever the precursor of the Global Fund was, the UN AIDS, I think was what it was called. And so we knew those people, we were supporting them. So there clearly was a growing awareness and support for funding for international programs to both try to prevent and respond to the emerging pandemic, which then was really, I can't remember the numbers, but certainly in South Africa, particularly, and in other parts of the world, was becoming a global phenomenon. So, and at some point, Senator Leahy and I, and there were other members with us, went to Africa, and one of the focuses of that trip was this. And so, this was pre-PEPFAR, but it was nevertheless in response to what we saw was a disease that was out of control.
Could you tell me a little bit more about your personal memories of that trip with Senator Leahy?
We went to a number of different countries. Most of what we did had nothing to do with this topic, but with respect to this, I do remember, we went to Uganda, which was sort of the epicenter at that point of the epidemic. And at that point, the policy of the Ugandan government was to prohibit the use of condoms. And it's a very Catholic country, and so the government had this policy, which was obviously going to significantly impede their ability or the ability of the international community to help them deal with a disease which was out of control. And I do remember Senator Leahy and I, and there may have been others with us, but accompanying a USAID health official, and we met with President Museveni at that time. I remember it was outside under this tent at his palace, and the purpose was to show him what was going to happen. That he had two choices, basically: either change their policy and support the use of condoms, which had been demonstrated was at that time one of the most effective ways of preventing the spread of the disease, or be prepared to basically see your army disappear and large numbers of the Ugandan population become infected. And the USAID official had this in graphics on his laptop, so he could show, here's what happens if you take this approach, here's what happens if you take this approach. And I think more than anything, it was that meeting which convinced President Museveni to change the policy. And that made a big difference, because it really got the disease under control in Uganda in ways that it hadn't been. And and then Uganda became sort of a test case or a model for what other countries needed to do.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So would that have been in the late 1990s?
I honestly can't remember. I remember some of the other senators who were with us, but I would have to, your guess is as good as mine. But it was in the 90s.
I remember Senator
I
Leahy
think.
talks about it in in the run-up to the passing of what eventually becomes the 2003 Act.
Okay.
So
Okay.
I'm sure we can figure that out.
So going back a little bit to the late 1990s, in 1998 there were the embassy bombings in Tanzania and Kenya, and there's a sense within the Clinton administration that HIV/AIDS is something of a security threat. I think both within Africa and maybe internationally. Could you tell us a little bit about your personal perspective on that, and also the perspective of people like Senator Leahy?
You know, here it seems to, it's almost like everything is now described as a security threat, a matter of national security. And I think there are both legitimate reasons for that, because they are, and also political motivations. Because if you define something as a national security threat, then people who might not otherwise be inclined to support whatever it is might see it as something that they should take more seriously. And so to what extent HIV/AIDS was, you know, portrayed in that manner in order to try to build broader support versus, in fact, make the point that it had national security implications. It's hard to say, but I think, you know, we saw it that way. You know, to the same extent that any pandemic, COVID, any deadly disease that gets out of control, Ebola, could certainly become a threat to national security, could become a threat to every single American who is either infected as a result of people coming to this country or from traveling overseas. So yes, I think we recognized that, but that wasn't really the motivation for why we got involved. Whether it was a national security threat or not, however one characterized it, it's clear that huge numbers of people were being infected with a disease that had no cure and no meaningful form of treatment. And, you know, that's something that you need to address.
This sort of leads into my next question. During the early 2000s, obviously the United States is dealing with a variety of different threats, challenges, and also dealing with both healthcare and public health, sort of big issues. In 2001, a letter containing anthrax was sent to Senator Leahy's office. I don't think it actually made it to Senator Leahy's office, but I'm wondering if there's any sort of connection in your thinking between American attempts to address the threat of bioterror at home and build public health infrastructure that might combat that, in building public health infrastructure abroad.
There wasn't for me. To me, the way to address HIV/AIDS was the way to address public health threats more broadly, and that is, and it remains, to create the capacity in other countries to conduct surveillance, to have the trained people who can provide treatment. It's for public education. It's the technology that's necessary. So to me, like everything that we do in international assistance overseas, it's really about empowering local people, in this case the medical community and governments, to understand the problem, to understand the epidemiology, to know how to address it, to know how to conduct quarantines when necessary, to inform the public, to have the necessary drugs and other technologies. So that's always been Senator Leahy's view of this, that we can't solve the world's health problems. Our biggest comparative advantage is that we have a lot of well-trained people, we know how to use technology, and we can help other countries manage their own health problems. And so what happened in this country with anthrax and
Mm-hmm.
our own, obviously we learned a lot from our own experience.
Mm-hmm.
But the challenge was in so many of these countries where the infrastructure is so limited,
Mm-hmm.
where there's so few trained people, where you don't have the mechanisms in place to respond to a disease of this severity,
Mm-hmm.
and where culture and other impediments or factors really make it difficult. Those were the kinds of things that we were focused on.
Mm-hmm. So in 1996, there's a huge breakthrough. We had the development of this antiretroviral drug cocktail, and a shockingly, rapid turn of events in the United States. We start to actually get the AIDS pandemic and epidemic here under control. In 99, 2000, Al Gore is running for the presidency. There's some pressure from activists to get Al Gore interested in the global HIV/AIDS problem. During this period, what was your perspective, so the period before PEPFAR, on what our best approach would be in Africa and in other places?
I think it was essentially as I've described. That is, we had, our own bilateral
Mm-hmm.
capabilities through USAID, through the State Department, and through CDC to an extent, to help countries respond and strengthen their own health infrastructure and
Mm-hmm.
capacity. And so that was our focus. And our job was to get the money.
Mm-hmm.
That was Senator Leahy's focus, was providing the funds
Mm-hmm.
to significantly expand our support
Mm-hmm.
for those types of
Mm-hmm.
interventions.
Mm-hmm.
And, it was woefully inadequate, but it was a lot more than $50 million.
Mm-hmm.
And so then, but it was also, of course, UNAIDS and other multilateral mechanisms that existed at the time that we were supporting. But this was pre-PEPFAR and pre-Global Fund.
Mm-hmm.
And it was only when they became available
Mm-hmm.
that we really were able to dramatically increase
Mm-hmm.
the amounts and the ways in which we were dealing
Mm-hmm.
with this problem.
Could you tell us a little bit about the legislation that you worked on? So 2003 is when President Bush introduces PEPFAR. Can you tell us a little bit about the legislation that you were working on in the years before that? So at the end of 2002, Congress almost passed a big piece of AIDS legislation.
I don't even remember. I'm sorry.
That's fine.
I was focused on the annual appropriations bills,
Yeah.
which is where the money is.
Yeah.
So any other legislation that authorizes,
Yeah.
everything under the sun
Yeah.
is, useful.
Yeah.
But ultimately, it's all about whether you have the money to do anything.
Understood.
And
yeah.
that was our job.
Okay.
And so I can't recall what that legislation was, but irrespective of that, we were providing whatever amounts we could,
Yeah.
which again, as I said, was a far cry from what was needed, given what was happening around the world.
Mm-hmm.
But we were doing what we could with the budgets that we were given
Mm-hmm.
to allocate as much as possible for this.
Mm-hmm. From your perspective, when did this become a major agenda item for the Bush administration?
I can't remember exactly, but obviously PEPFAR was a huge initiative
Yeah.
on their part. And my counterpart, who at that point I think was working in the Bush administration at OMB, Robin Cleveland, she clearly was directly involved in the conceptualization of this and putting it forward. And so, we ultimately had to authorize it.
Yeah.
And interestingly, that fell to the Appropriations Committee.
Yeah.
Not the way things are usually done, but that's how this happened to occur. And so myself and my counterpart in the House at that point, who was on the Republican side, Charlie Flickner, Terry Peel on the Democratic side. There were several of us whose job it was to, incorporate this into the appropriations legislation. And, but more than that, our job was to find the money. And, the way things work is that the president requests a budget. Usually it falls far short of what we think ought to be spent on whatever it is. But in this case, it was in fact a presidential initiative. And so it was something that President Bush felt strongly about. And it was a matter of convincing the Congress to support it.
So you mentioned Robin Cleveland from the Bush administration. In Congress, who was persuading people to go along with the PEPFAR idea? And did it seem like it came out of nowhere, or did it seem very natural to people?
I don't really remember. Was Senator Frist the majority leader then? Because he would have obviously been instrumental, a physician by training, and but beyond that, there were undoubtedly multiple members of the House and the Senate who were interested and strongly supportive of this. Leahy being one, in his case being the person in the Senate who had principal responsibility for providing the funding. But there were others. I just can't remember who they were.
Yeah. Do you remember, so some of the big issues were, should this be multilateral through the Global Fund, abstinence, education?
Yeah, there were battles over certain aspects of this. And those battles to some extent continue to this day. And it all gets wrapped up in the abortion issue, and it's really kind of unfortunate because that constrained some of the things we were able to do. Senator Leahy, had one perspective. There were certainly people on the Republican side who had a different perspective, and those issues were fiercely debated. On balance, though, the outcome was pretty significant in terms of the United States now creating this huge initiative involving billions of dollars. And while there were still arguments about what we should be, what the U.S. government should be funding. I think as a practical matter, it was a major advance, obviously, over what we had been doing. And I think there was very strong bipartisan support overall. Now, we also had differences, Senator Leahy and people on our side versus some on the Republican side, versus the merits of PEPFAR versus supporting multilateral or international organizations like UNAIDS, like the Global Fund. Our view was the more the better, that there are certain countries where PEPFAR isn't going to be able to carry out programs, and where the United Nations can, for example, or where the Global Fund can. And the Global Fund, was focused on not just HIV, but malaria and TB as well. And so, there were advantages to PEPFAR, and there were advantages to the Global Fund. And those comparative advantages remain the case today. Our job was to try to ensure that they worked both, they coordinated well and they complemented each other. And I think, in general, they have. They serve, they're trying to get at largely the same problem, but often they have to approach it in somewhat different ways. And I think, we we felt, and I think it's been borne out, that there was a strong need for both.
Mm-hmm. So what was your relationship? You mentioned your House counterpart. How did you interact with Republican staffers, members of Congress? To an extent, it seems like this piece of legislation, there was a lot of conflict over it, but also at the same time, it happened really rapidly.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, I mean, ironically, on the Appropriations Committee, the staff, you know, it's a unique committee because unlike other committees, what we do is produce the budget to run the government,
Mm-hmm.
the funding.
Mm-hmm.
And if we don't do it, the government shuts down. So it tends to attract people who, you know, believe in compromise,
Mm-hmm.
who recognize that, you know, at the end of the day, we have to agree. And that means doing things for the other side and them doing things for you so that ultimately everyone feels they have a stake in the outcome and can
Mm-hmm.
support it.
Mm-hmm.
And that's quite different from most committees.
Mm-hmm.
And so, yes, there were certain kind of red lines for each, perhaps, on
Yeah.
this, just the way there is today.
Mm-hmm.
But overall, you know, the Appropriations Committee attracts people who tend to be problem solvers,
Mm-hmm.
and again, who believe in compromise, and understand that that's essential to the job. And so I think also, you know, those of us who worked on those subcommittees, the House, State, Foreign Operations, and Senate, you know, we traveled a lot, we interact with a lot of people from all over the world. You know, we tend to have a pretty good idea of what's happening. We could see what was happening. We obviously felt that there was a huge role for the United States to play in trying to help countries deal with this global pandemic. And so, you know, it's just a matter of how best to do that.
And so I'll ask one more question about this period. Did you have any sort of feelings or support for or reservations about the use of faith-based organizations in implementing PEPFAR?
You know, the problem for us was that they were not willing to support certain interventions which we knew were effective.
Mm-hmm.
And that made no sense to us.
Mm-hmm.
Obviously, or rather, it seemed to us, if you're dealing with a disease like this, you should use whatever means you have that people can voluntarily protect themselves with. But we also knew that faith-based organizations have a long history of working overseas with vulnerable communities. And so even though we disagreed to some extent with ways in which they were unwilling to participate, we still felt that they had an important role to play. And so it wasn't that those of us who maybe disagreed with some of their thinking didn't think they should be part of it. We did want them involved. It was just that we had a disagreement about, you know, how best to combat this disease. You know, abstinence was just an utterly unrealistic approach to a problem in many of these countries. And so we had disagreements about that. If we thought it had worked, you know, we would have been all for it. And we didn't rule it out. You know, we said, you know, okay, you know, if that's what you're going to do, you know, good luck to you. But we also could see that that was not the solution for most of where the epidemic was occurring.
You mentioned the Uganda model. Was that fairly persuasive to people in Congress and to people like you?
I think it became certainly, I mean, obviously, making condoms available and educating people about how to use them and empowering women, etc. That was a major way to control the disease. So I think that became widely accepted.
We can talk a little bit about the nuts and bolts of PEPFAR. We often hear that PEPFAR was a revolutionary program. From your perspective, in what sense was it revolutionary?
It was maybe revolutionary insofar as the scale.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, there are not many other examples of where the U.S. government has done something quite like this.
Mm-hmm.
Not that I'm aware of, at least not in the last 40 years,
Mm-hmm.
and probably not before that. So yeah, I think it was, I don't know if I'd call it revolutionary, but it was unique.
Uh-huh.
And it was because, the AIDS pandemic was unlike anything any of us had
Yeah.
confronted
Yeah.
in our lifetimes or in modern history. And
Yeah.
so it required a unique response, and I think PEPFAR attempted to be that response.
Mm-hmm.
Now, this was largely developed by the White House with input at that time by the majority, who were the Republicans.
Mm-hmm.
It had Democratic input,
Mm-hmm.
obviously, and ultimately we had to all come together
Mm-hmm.
to make it a reality.
Mm-hmm.
If we had been in the majority, or if we had
Mm-hmm.
been in the driver's seat, so to speak, we might have done things a bit differently. I suspect there were things about PEPFAR that undoubtedly would have looked different if we had undertaken it. But I think it was just a huge leap forward from where we had been.
Mm-hmm.
And that's why I think everyone who recognized the urgency and the scope and the devastation that AIDS was causing got behind it so quickly.
Mm-hmm. As it was being implemented, there was kind of a tussle between State Department, CDC, and other people over the actual implementation. Do you have any memories of that?
Well, not specifically, but that's true of almost everything that we do around here. So, you had multiple agencies involved. They each bring certain expertise or capabilities, and they all want the money.
Mm-hmm.
So there's invariably tug of war between them.
Mm-hmm.
And there are big egos involved,
Mm-hmm.
and turf battles, and that's kind of in the nature of the business. And so, yes, that actually continues to exist in our global health programs, but it's not unique.
Mm-hmm.
And I think actually, overall, those issues were not so dominant that they caused major disruptions or constraints on what we could collectively accomplish.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned other global public health policies. Where does PEPFAR, thinking about sort of the Bush period, the war on terrorism, where did PEPFAR fit into our broader foreign policy?
Well, I think, it's pretty widely seen as a very significant way in which the United States has engaged with countries all over the world to address a major public health threat. And so in that sense, it's what not just governments, but people down to the smallest communities know about the United States, that this was something that originated with us and that they identify as being an American initiative. And so I think that a lot of foreign policy is about building relations, building goodwill, finding ways to coordinate and cooperate with other countries to solve problems. And so this was, a unique way in which we were doing that was very visible, widely recognized. And so I think it brought a lot of goodwill for the United States. At the same time, it saved, the lives of many people. So in that sense, it was a piece of our foreign policy or global leadership, so to speak, that I think, unlike some of the other things that we've done around the world, really spoke positively about the United States and has been recognized as a piece of our foreign policy that has really had a very positive impact on people.
There's a lot of talk about accountability with PEPFAR and sort of measuring what's going on the ground. From the perspective of the Senate, what does accountability look like?
That's an issue that we have for almost everything we do around the world. Because our ability to monitor and conduct oversight is quite limited. We have only a few staff. Our budget today is $50 billion for that subcommittee. Hundreds of programs, thousands of organizations all over the world dealing with all kinds of problems. Our ability to conduct real oversight is very limited. So we depend on the reporting requirements that implementing partners have to comply with. We depend on investigative journalists, on inspectors general, on the Government Accountability Office, on various ways in which funds are monitored and programs are accounted for. We don't, unlike I think some people might think, we don't hand out money. We enter into grant agreements or contracts with implementing partners, whether it's a multilateral organization like the United Nations, like UNICEF, or Mercy Corps. But we contract or provide grants for specific services, either training or equipment or technology or drugs, etc. And so, it's not that difficult to monitor what the money is being spent for. The challenge becomes, when you're in a small village in Malawi, what's happening to those drugs and those laptops or those vehicles or those people, whatever. And, again, the implementing partners have to report, and it's a pretty onerous process on the use of the funds that we provide, but it's not foolproof. There's invariably some waste, some loss, but I've always been struck by how when those stories come out, it's usually about a fairly small amount relative to the big picture. And when you think about where we're working, in very poor countries where there's a lot of corruption, where almost everything is working against you, there's inevitably going to be some loss or some projects that don't succeed. But overall, I think the consensus would be that PEPFAR funds have been, on the whole, extremely well used, and the results kind of speak for themselves.
And that was a big frame for the Bush administration, right? This is going to be a program that's highly accountable to us. Is PEPFAR unique in that sense?
Well, some types of programs are more easily accountable than others. I mean, you can count how many boxes of condoms, for example, you're paying for. Whereas, another program might be, training people about, training police how to combat transnational criminal organizations. And so how you measure success or how you account for money and measure results it's really apples and oranges. So PEPFAR, I think there were aspects of it that would be quite easy to account for, the commodities that you're providing, the training that you're providing, etc. But there are other aspects to it that I suspect aren't so easy. But overall, I think a lot of the things that we do internationally are harder to point to specific results because it's often about changing behavior over periods of time versus buying things.
Right. In 2008, PEPFAR was reauthorized. Could you tell us a little bit about that process, maybe the ways in which the landscape had changed between 2003 and 2008?
You know, I remember nothing about that. I'm sorry. I mean, I would assume that it was an easier process, but I actually don't know. I just don't remember there being a big fight. But you know, there might have been over some things. I can't remember.
Yeah, that's fine. And I mean, so later on, obviously, in recent years, it's been very contentious. Do you have a sense of what changed?
You know, it's really kind of a mystery to me but it's not just PEPFAR that's changed, obviously. Our whole foreign assistance program budget is under assault. And the people who have devoted their careers to building the expertise and building the relationships with counterparts in other governments, you know, have been fired, and we've seen just the entire kind of motivation for why we engage with other countries to address problems which neither we nor they can solve alone, but which affect us invariably, kind of almost seen as, you know, not in our national interest. You know, it's not part of whatever America First is. So, you know, I think there's a sense that we've been carrying too much of the burden, when in fact, on a per capita basis, our contribution to these types of programs is way, way down at the bottom of the list of industrialized countries. You know, we have the capability that most countries couldn't dream of. And for the most part, it's funding U.S. organizations to carry out programs overseas that directly or indirectly affect us. And so, you know, PEPFAR is just one of many programs which is under assault right now by people who I think have no idea what these programs do, why they're important, the difference that they've made over the years, the consequences of walking away from them, not just for people who now are facing the prospect of not having access to the drugs and other ways to protect themselves, but also just for our relations with other countries, now seen as as a country that can't really be depended on, that you know, is no longer a reliable partner. So PEPFAR, I think, is now one of many programs which are in great jeopardy. My own view is that, you know, in the end, PEPFAR will come out sort of okay because there is still bipartisan support, but everything is being downsized so that, you know, our international assistance budget is going to be reduced by probably 20 to 30%. And PEPFAR, because it's such a big piece of that, will invariably be impacted.
You mentioned that things would look just a little bit different if the Democrats had been in control in 2003. Did things change when President Obama became president? Did he have a vision for PEPFAR that seemed distinct from the earlier vision?
I don't really recall much of a difference. It was unquestionably, this is important for us to support, but I don't remember any big new initiative or modification. It was rather, this is, you know, it's more like, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. This is working. It's important. It's a way in which, you know, we protect ourselves at the same time we protect others from this disease. And it's obviously built a huge amount of goodwill for the United States around the world. And why would you want to walk away from that?
And how about...
So I think that kind of illustrated the bipartisan nature of this. That, you know, Republican and Democratic presidents and Congresses have all gotten behind it, even though it was initially a Bush idea. That really didn't matter to us.
And same for the first Trump presidency and for Biden?
Yeah, I don't recall much angst over PEPFAR during those years. It's really been just in the last 6 months that we've seen this wholesale assault against our international affairs budget, and PEPFAR is a big piece of that. And you know, there's all kinds of misinformation as well about PEPFAR and how it's all about, you know, promoting abortions and all this, you know, none of which is true. We're dealing with the same with respect to the Global Fund, which is now also our contribution in real jeopardy. So, you know, this is something that is kind of across the board.
And you know, one of the hallmarks of PEPFAR, as you noted, was its bipartisanship. Why was PEPFAR so bipartisan? Why was it that everyone was on board with this?
You know, I think just enough people recognized that it was the right thing to do, and that it was in every respect in our own interest. That this was not a disease that kind of could be, you know, kept away from us any more than any other country. That everyone was vulnerable, and that since we had developed the capability to deal with it, that is to help people reduce their vulnerability, that just, you know, on a purely moral basis, it would have been unconscionable for us to not make that technology available. So it was both self-interest and also, I think, a recognition that we had a moral responsibility.
You talked a little bit about this as we talked about the contemporary politics of PEPFAR. What would the implications be if this program was not reauthorized, or if the United States pulled out?
I think it would be a disaster for millions of people around the world, and for us, because if HIV, you know, kind of resurges and rates of infection increase, it invariably will come to this country. There are millions of Americans traveling all over the world, and serving overseas in the military, in humanitarian crises, studying abroad, working abroad. And so, you know, again, PEPFAR is not in and of itself the solution to the HIV/AIDS problem. It's much bigger than that, and that's why the Global Fund is important, while helping other countries build their own public health capabilities, etc. But it's a major piece of it. And if we were to just walk away from that, it would not only create, you know, real risk for Americans, but also you would see the rates of infection increasing significantly in other countries, and we would lose a lot of the gains that we've made. I mean, it would be supremely stupid.
What does it mean for you personally to have been involved in a program like PEPFAR, something that went on to save 25 million lives?
You know, I was, you know, one of many who were involved, and you know, for me, the most meaningful part is that I was there at the beginning when PEPFAR didn't exist. You know, it was just me and Mike Williams, and we were able to put this money in the budget. Senator Leahy, you know, was obviously someone who quickly understood why this was important, but that was just, you know, at the very sort of nascent point. And so to have been here throughout the years with UNAIDS and the Global Fund and PEPFAR, and being able to play a role in ensuring that as much money as we could afford was available to support all of those efforts. That was something that made the job meaningful and where you felt like you were really making a difference. And again, if we were to walk away from that, both the consequences that would have for people everywhere, but also for our reputation and our relations with other countries would be, just, I think, a huge loss. So, on the one hand, I felt, that I was lucky to be able to be a part of that, but I also think that we have to do everything possible to protect what we've accomplished, and, frankly, we ought to be doing more. There are still lots of places where people who are vulnerable to HIV/AIDS don't have, the kinds of drugs that are now available, where, there are now medications that can pretty much eliminate one's vulnerability to HIV/AIDS. Now, why wouldn't we want to try to make that available to everybody? Because if we have it, it seems to me that would be something that we should want everybody to have access to. And also, it obviously protects us.
What are, thinking about other global health problems, foreign policy challenges that we face, assistance, are there any lessons from PEPFAR that we can learn?
One of the benefits of PEPFAR and the Global Fund is that in order for them to, be able to use the money effectively, it has translated into helping countries build their own public health systems. And so it's had impacts that go far beyond HIV/AIDS, malaria, and TB. It's helped in terms of countries' ability to respond to Ebola, monkeypox, H1N1, avian flu, etc., COVID. But one thing we've learned is that there will be new viruses, new pandemics. COVID might look like child's play compared to what could be next. And so, we need to learn from PEPFAR and from the Global Fund and from our experience with COVID that these are different ways of responding to what is almost certainly going to be a continuing challenge as the Earth's population increases, as people and wildlife come into more contact, as populations are more transient or more mobile, diseases, viruses can adapt so easily that, I think we should be prepared for responding to something that could be even worse than HIV/AIDS in the future. And PEPFAR is one lesson for us in terms of how one can fairly quickly mobilize significant resources and the people and the knowledge in ways that can, mount an effective response. But the last thing, therefore, we ought to be doing is to be reducing our involvement in these types of ways that will invariably help us prepare for the next pandemic. We built up knowledge, infrastructure. The pharmaceutical companies have developed new drugs that we couldn't have dreamed of when we first started. And we really can now control HIV/AIDS and not eliminate it, but control it in ways that it's no longer really a major public health threat if you use, what we now have. But a lot of countries don't have that, and a lot of public health professionals don't get paid enough, and they leave their countries, and so we invest in people, and then they're working in France, and so we've learned a lot from this experience, but we need to apply those lessons because we're going to be dealing with this type of thing forever, and it could be much worse than what we've seen so far.
Yeah. You mentioned a number of the people who were involved in this process and covered a lot of ground. I'm wondering if there's anything that I haven't asked that is central to this story and that we should know about.
If my memory were any good, there probably is, but I really credit, President Bush and the people who were, it probably wasn't him, but it might have been, I don't know. But certainly the people who were working with him at that time in recognizing that, this was something that the United States could and should do. To what extent that was motivated by political considerations versus other considerations, I have no idea. But, he clearly took a personal interest in this. And, I think on the flip side, the fact that Democrats, were fully embraced it, even though a Republican initiative, everyone recognized that this wasn't a time to be trying to, take credit for things. It was rather about how to get behind something and make it as successful as possible. And, I think that has largely been the attitude ever since until now. And now, the question is, will people on the Republican side who seem to, so far be unwilling to break with whatever the White House is proposing, in this case, ensure that, PEPFAR receives the funds and the support that it needs in the face of attempts to significantly reduce or to really significantly downgrade our support for it. And I really don't know yet. But I think, I think it's good that you're focusing on this because it is a kind of a unique thing that happened, and there are a lot of lessons that we've learned over the years from it. And while each disease is different and requires different types of responses, and often, one's ability to deal with an epidemic depends on the government, the Uganda example being one, but there are many others, where culture and government bureaucracy and other factors can be major constraints. But, I think what PEPFAR shows is that you can overcome those. And if you have the facts and you can show people what choices they have and what the consequences will be, and you're prepared to provide them with the support that they need and the training, and then we showed that we could really do something that hadn't been done before.
Do you think this would be possible in the present era?
I think if common sense prevails, yes. But I think it's early to say. We'll know more by probably December, when this appropriations process has sort of run its course. But I think we have two challenges. One is ideological. Another is political. And then the third is resources. We are facing a dramatic reduction in our top line for international assistance programs. And so invariably, everyone is going to pay a price for that, including PEPFAR. And that is exactly the opposite direction that we should be going. The world is becoming much more complex, much more dangerous in many ways, many more people. The risk of public health crises is increasing, not decreasing. And so PEPFAR is important because HIV/AIDS is still very much a public health threat in many parts of the world, but it's also important for the infrastructure that it provides, the knowledge that it provides, and you don't want to lose that.
Thank you so much for talking with us today.
Thank you.
Okay.